And I wanted to ask you, Michael, because this seems again touch a little bit into the fact of what you talked about human beings being turned into to robots pretty much as well. Because if the mentality is like a robot, it doesn't really matter what comes down the line, so to speak. But what we're seeing is the extension now even of this in one way, the scientific approach to this, and that the humans don't have any consciousness, etc. Is this transhumanist movement, which is the extension of the scientific model, pretty much, where we're totally removed from all kinds of humanity. You know,
this is how it works, because all of these philosophers ultimately then looked to this. They looked to this because you have to give purpose and meaning then to those people in the social hive. Once you've given over your selfhood to the social hive, well, that social hive has to have some sort of purpose, doesn't it? The ants are doing something, all the time. There's activity. But let's look at another incredible aspect of this. These outsiders who are then living, they're going to be in continual state of existential anxiety. And it's not healthy, authentic anxiety. It's the anxiety that's created by you. Well, it's the conflict that arises between you trying to maintain your own ideas against those of the collective, which is exactly what you see when you see anyone in this world. Say, for instance, the teenagers, or anybody. They're going to be in perpetual conflict just by doing that. So what's the result? The result is the danger that people cannot live with that type of depression and that conflict, and then they give themselves over to the mass because it's just too much stress to, have that tension between your own ideas that make you an individual, which is very hard to come by. You have to go through a big wasteland experience. If you leave the collective for a while, you might rush back because it's quite, bleak before you've actually found the road to the true you, before you get into your dharma. It can sometimes be a period of loneliness that people don't like that, and then they rush back.
Yeah.
And then there's something even more sinister. Let's never forget the limbic and the emotional component of all of this. When man cannot be individual, because like Hegel says, it's a truism that your individuality is innately tied up with visions of other people and their visions of you and the approval rating and all of these kinds of things, then you are living, as time goes by, as history passes, you actually are constantly living with the feeling that you're not whole. You are not individual. And so then your mind starts creating this sort of fictional, analog individual self. It's part of the reason why we like to watch movies with Clint Eastwood and Arnold Schwarzenegger and other sort of movies of that ilk, where you have these big guys, the big projected Superman types, who then represent that feeling of he's the stranger, he's the strong individual person who thinks for himself, he's monotone, and so forth and so on.
He takes the law into his own hands and do what he wants to,
And hugely, women identify with this enormously, and men do as well. But go one step further. The religions have created their Jesuses and their gods to actually be that projection, to pacify the outsider. That's what it is. That's what God and Jesus are. And that's why you read in the story of Jesus, which was very well contrived to make him appear to be a renegade within his own society, to be betrayed by one of his own, to be against the state, the police state, the Romans, to be against the Sanhedrin and the Jews. You see, so this Christ is a perfectly contrived character who represents that individuality. That's part of the reason why people believe in these gurus and glowing sort of iconic figures. Then, of course, the martyr's death, the lonely road to Calvary, and then they wheel that image out every, so often to make you, again, it's a very powerful archetype that you identify with limbically and emotionally, because you don't have that. So the system creates individuals on all sorts of levels who have this existential aura of individualism and individuality, because you yourself don't have it. So there's a whole, remember you were asking earlier about identification. Well, this is hugely part of this. And so the God and the Christ is a compromise.
That's incredible, because that explains quite a few things of basically why we can see this archetype, the Christ archetype, revamped in different versions in the entertainment business. Charlton Heston, the Omega Man, that's a full-on Jesus story right there, but we have modern examples of that too. Even in the new 2012 movie, we have a JC character running around and saving everybody, of course, but he's on the outside. He's very individual in that sense as well, going against the grain. It's really fascinating. That's incredible.
And not all of them are propagandist, you do have true models of it. But on the whole, yes, a lot of the Hollywood, sort of Sean Connery, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Bruce Willis types, this is bogus to the nth degree. And underneath that, remember, it's all Orwellian trickery. They create these pseudo individuals. And if you really are an existentialist and you watch these films, of course you're like laughing. It's just ridiculous.
Yeah.
But here we go. They do this even in the National Treasure films. It's ubiquitous, and this is again one of the things that people need to be aware of. And I think that that's why the establishment, because we're talking about behaviorists here, on paper, behaviorists are meant to be atheists. So why does a culture that is pretty much atheistic, materialistic, agnostic permit religion to have so much power? It's for this reason, because if you don't have the religion, you can't have these pseudo-individualistic icons that people are going to give their allegiance to. So a religion plays an enormous part. There's many of the Orwellian types as well, could care less about religion. They're not religious, but they have to go through this facade of pretending that they go to church and pretending that they are all into, values and religion, because they know what will happen if you pull that away. If you deconstruct religion, you're going to have a serious problem of the machinery grinding to a halt. But there's even one more interesting thing to go into here, because of course by Hegel's definition that society is all good and your allegiance to it is all good, by the same definition that your ego is basically a social ego, what happens if the society that he's talking about is basically the source of evil? He may or may not have admitted this, but just for argument's sake, what happens if the Hegelian populace, the Hegelian unit of society is a corrupting influence? Then instantaneously you immediately see that there's going to be a negative effect on the consciousness of those human beings, because there's such a inviolable identification going on. They're literally one and the same thing to Hegel. Your idea of yourself, what you call the I-ness, is a social I-ness. And therefore, whatever happens in society, say something aberrant starts happening in society, you automatically are going to be infected with that in some sort of Star Trek, way in which you're not even going to be aware of it, like some sort of Quatermass way in which you're literally magnetized and roped in. And so whatever society does, you are going to be affected or infected, you see, by that very pestilence. This is another huge problem here. And I'd say also that I talked about Freud coming later. Hegel's model is Freudian to a point, because the social ego, as we said, is created by society. Now, remember that all psychologists, this is what people like, all philosophers do not talk about repression.
Okay.
Right? This is a difference between the two schools. In psychology, you hear about a fascinating capacity of the ego, which is called repression, which means that the parts that cause you pain, the parts of yourself that you don't like, anything that would cause conflict and stress, the mind has an ability to repress it into what's known as the unconscious, and so that you can have a sort of homeostasis of the ego, so it can function, right? Okay, so then backtrack and fuse together the Freudian model of repression and the ego and Hegel, and you have something absolutely incredible. And Freud would agree, but for different reasons. If the state and if the system, the populace, is controlling your sense of identity, then isn't it going to be the force that demands what it is that you repress about yourself?
Yeah.
Because again, in the psychological model, you are basically the one who sort of decides, right? But if you tie in the Hegelian aspect, no, it's everyone that you've met, everyone that has an influence of your life, including the people in the world, the whole matrix out there, the whole human collectivism, is the very thing that is policing people to repress aspects of themselves so that they conform to this mechanical, technological, because the word technology means more than just machines. It's a way of thinking. And so that kind of indoctrination then causes the Freudian forms of repression. And this is extremely important to understand, because anything that is antithetical to the mores, and the likes and dislikes of the society will then have to be repressed. And in Freudian terms, it's the superego that handles this. It's a part of the ego that censors and represses any undesirable content. And the reason why it's undesirable is because it causes you pain. Well, what causes people more pain than not being accepted by their fellows or feeling always like an outsider?
Yeah, yeah.
So this is if it turns out that the only definition of consciousness is not that you have a personal ego, but that it's purely collectivized. And the behaviors believe this. The Calvinists in their own way believe this because they're collective. And if the Hegelians and the global village people all believe this, then you can understand now why we're heading towards this Walden 2 situation. There is no consciousness at all.
Yeah.
There's only mechanism, machine. And any concept of selfhood that you even have is utterly subservient to the social hive, to their social conditioning, and anything about yourself that doesn't correspond or is frowned upon, you see, or doesn't gel with, is not part of the acculturated self, is going to be repressed. And the final component of this is even more fascinating, because don't forget that the Freudian perspective on the unconscious was different than Carl Jung's.
Yeah.
And it's different in this way. Freud believed that everything that is in the unconscious is put there during this individual life. Okay. It's really a pre-conscious dumpster of just this life that you've lived.
Okay, yeah.
So this is his definition. And that definition, of course, became slightly adapted or slightly modified by Carl Jung, who said, no, the unconscious is actually a reservoir that is programmed over millennia by all human beings' existences.
Right,
it's a collective unconscious, okay?
Yeah.
Then still bear in mind what we've been talking about with Hegel and Freud. But you just change Freud's understanding that it's not a dumping ground of this life, it's the dumping ground of all mankind. So it's bigger. That means physically and energetically that the so-called unconscious is vast. It's a bigger thing. It has greater magnitude than the little ego that is the censoring apparatus, that sort of peaks up above the waters, so to speak, and interfaces with this world. And then you even go further than that, and you go into other people's definitions of the unconscious, people like the Taoists, the Native American Indians, even philosophers like Martin Heidegger, and they insist that the unconscious is even yet more than that. The unconscious is the place which your true self, right? Not the persona we've been describing, not the social sense of I-ness, but the true self, your true selfhood, which embodies your connection to divinity, which embodies your connection to nature. When you were once upon a time in ancient times guided by nature, and nature was your guide, and you didn't have a subjective sense of self.
Yeah.
In the same ludicrous way that we have today, when nature was your guide and you were in harmony with the universe. These people are even saying that part of you that is called the unconscious is where that is. That is where your so-called spirit and soul and self and your intelligence, your higher forms of intelligence, your deeper senses, that's where that is. So if that is the case, and I personally believe that is the case, and that's why it's very important to open up to the unconscious in whatever way that person can manage this, then we start to see, by again flipping it over and coming back to the Hegelian paradigm, what the global village mentality is trying to do, what the religions are trying to do. They're trying to make you as outer directed as possible. They're trying to make you as mechanical as possible. They're trying to make you as subservient to consensus trance as possible, for one reason and one reason only: to pull you further and further into your ego. And I don't even mean a healthy ego. I mean Hegel's definition of it, the public ego, the impersonal ego, or one might even say the narcissist, the malignant narcissistic ego. You see, there's all sorts of ways you can look at this. The non-self, whatever you want to call it. By pulling a man away from that, you are murdering true individualism. But you can't do that, Henrik, without giving something equally alluring on the outside. It doesn't work unless you have the carrot as well.
Exactly.
And that's where your technology comes in.
This is also, never mind if human beings live multiple lives, if we're talking about reincarnation, all that stuff here, we can just view this from the point of view of the unconscious then their job, the globalist job, and maybe that's why the process is so slow as well, because it actually is about programming the unconscious as well. If they're trying to slowly change what a human being is, then they have to do this over a very long period of time in order for us to even change the unconscious, because it's handled through us, if you know what I mean. if we are programmed in a certain way, if all of humanity is programmed in a certain way, then maybe next generation down the line it will be even more simple to program them, etc., etc., etc. Right?
Well, that's right. What greater war? I've said it till I'm blue in the face. The war on consciousness. The war on consciousness. What greater travesty? What greater mutilation? What greater act of violence can you do than separating a man from his own selfhood?
Not much.
You know, Ayn Rand, William Blake. William Blake referred to, he didn't use the term unconscious for obvious reasons. He lived before Freud and Jung. He referred to the unconscious as imagination.
Yeah, yeah.
Not in the same way that we've used that word today. He used the word imagination as a broad term to represent this ancestral consciousness. It's not about reincarnation in that mystical way. It's about the whole content of our unconscious being all the experiences of all men and women who've lived historically.
Yes.
Based on the Jungian model that all experiences become concepts, become ideas, and then become archetypes. But the Blakean model is even more pure than Jung, because Jung also said that the unconscious was, he also believed that the unconscious contained negative powers. For him, it was mostly positive, but it did contain elements like what he called the archetypes. And he believed that the archetypes have darker sides as well that can be threatening to the ego. So you still have a certain model there in which the unconscious is seen as something kind of nasty and potentially ambiguous and ambivalent and dangerous. This is a very traditional stance in all psychology. But if you step a little bit out of psychology and go back to the poets and the great thinkers like Rainer Maria Rilke and William Blake and many others I could mention, they look at the unconscious as entirely positive. So much so that even the so-called things that are negative in it are positive. And if anything is negative in it, it's because of this repressive dynamic that's going on in the conscious mind. So they have a completely holistic understanding of man's deeper selfhood, which they refer to by different terms. This has to be borne in mind. And then what you say is very true. It has to be slow, because how on earth can you stranglehold, and garrote the unconscious and separate man's conscious mind from his unconscious? It takes a lot of doing. But that is what society is. We do not have civilization. We only have tyranny. We do not have justice. We only have injustice. Man is the one who's creating the society. Remember we said at the beginning, man is doing this. Man is tyrannizing man. We forget this because it's always them. It's always the Wizard of Oz, the guy behind the mask, the guy behind the curtain. The guy behind the curtain is a man.
Yeah.
The people who are doing this are human beings. We buy into it. It's a consensus. I mean, it's what do we call it? It's a contract. Man is creating society. Man represses man. Man goes and murders indigenous people and calls them savages. Man is the one who's building the global village. Man is the one, running and hiding from himself. Man is the one who sees nature as a demonic presence. Man is the one who wants some bogus heaven after he's dead and gone. Man is the one who sends children down the mines. Man is the one who murders his fellows for no reason.
But Michael, on top of that, I guess, if it's true about the archetypes, then we might look at a situation where some of these individuals who are doing this actually have come to identify with some of these more demonic forces, if you will, and actually are playing out this archetypal evil seed in the world, if you know what I mean.
Yes, that's one theory. That is a definite there's legitimacy to that. The existential psychologists, people like Otto Rank and others, and Viktor Frankl and all, they don't buy into that at all. They have since changed their ideas about the unconscious, and they believe that it is entirely man's estrangement from his unconscious and his commitment to the consensus that causes this aberration, that man is cut off from the veins and arteries or the roots, that go deeply into the soil.
Yes.
And but these psychologists are not saying anything that isn't even in the Bible. The book of Mark says it is from within, out of the mind of man, that all evil emerges. And of course, there's the rebuttal. There is the rebuttal of psychology, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of people go, I know my unconscious is full of garbage. Why would I want to go and dig through garbage? And my answer to that is because it's your garbage. It's part of you. Your conscious mind thinks of it as recalcitrant. It thinks of it as toxic waste. No, those are aspects of yourself that are only thrown into a pseudo-darkness because you're addicted to the light. You are a disciple of the light, the false light. But that light has a particular property which throws all the rest of your consciousness, you see, into darkness.
Michael, I want to take a little break here at this point, begin to round things up with the first hour, and then continue talking more with you in our members section. But is there anything more you want to mention here in the last couple of minutes in regards to what you call the positive thinking cult? There's a few more things maybe we can bring up about that before we round things off for the first hour, Michael.
Only that it was a response. It has to be understood in the context of history. It was a response to this Calvinism and certain aspects of this behaviorism, and it's legitimate to that extent. That people needed to lighten up, and think more about themselves and their own prosperity and so forth and so on. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that. But the other aspect why I wanted to talk about this is because, do you remember in the show we did last week, part 1, we talked about and discussed that it's very important that the face that you show to the unconscious, or we said that it's important to know what kind of face you're showing to the unconscious, because the unconscious is purely reflexive. Whatever face you shine into it, it will reflect back. Remember that?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, maybe we can pick up with that in the second part, because it's a bit longer to explain. But that's what I thought when I listened back to the show, is that I had said something and people could have misinterpreted. When I talked about showing a loving and a strong, a positive face to the unconscious, I didn't mean your Prozac smiling face.
Right.
That's disaster. You're still going to meet demons. Even you go, well, I'm very positive. I'm showing a really good face to the unconscious. Oh my God, why is it Dracula is appearing? Well, because I didn't mean, right? I didn't mean, because remember, we have to now we even have to redefine what we mean by happy, strong, loving, and positive, because those things have been completely co-opted by this evangelical, canned, motivational, Anthony Robbins, pump it till it hurts, go, 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 sort of California, it's all one season world, malarkey, palaver, and if people don't interpret it correctly, they'll be thinking that's the kind of face that you have to show to the unconscious. Well, that's doom. That's not going to work at all.
Okay, well, that's very interesting. Let's talk about some of that, Michael, in our next segment here.